Okay, welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum. This is actually a re-recording of a talk that we gave here at the museum in September called Labour, Learning and Politics, the Irish and Gilded Age, Albany. And it was part of the Glimpses of the Gilded Age series from historic Cherry Hills series. So we had terrible technical problems that night. There was construction going on next to us, and they cut through the wire that was providing our internet, which did not recover for about 48 hours. So midstream, we were cut off. So the original video, most of which was kind of, we almost got through all of the talk, is on YouTube. But I'm just going to re-record the talk so that the series can be complete. So okay, here's the my presentation, and I hope that Cherry Hills series has continued, and in fact they have one more talk I think to go on December 8th. So the Gilded Age brings to my mind almost exclusively images of excess and inequality. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times sort of vibe. Robber barons, alternatively known as captains of industry, depending on maybe your politics, lived lives of unimagined luxury, while working class people, including newly arrived immigrants, laboured under horrific conditions and often organised for better ones. It was an age of extremes, of polarisation, and was characterised by gross materialism and blatant political corruption. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, which transformed the west of the country as much as the Erie Canal had done for this region 40 years earlier. So with that expansion, of course, the American economy rose at its fastest rate in its history. US factory output rose from 1.9 billion to 13 billion between 1860 and 1900. Wealth disparity then, of course, also increased. During the same time period, the wealthiest 2% of American households reportedly owned more than 1/3 of the country's wealth, and the top 10% owned approximately 3/4 of it. Perhaps actually not unlike our own times today. The working class suffered tremendously, but rich Americans lived very lavishly. And Irish immigrants and also Irish Americans were sort of at the heart of this entire experience, often on both sides. So I'm just going to kind of take you through some of the wealthier images, of these expansions. Naturally, the capital region, as the capital of the state, saw and felt all of these changes too. Thriving industries and multiple factories, coupled with old money who were still here, meant that this area was a welcoming place for immigrants. Long established Irish roots here, because the Irish had actually come in as early as the Dutch settlement, had been strengthened and added to since the Erie Canal days. And so chain migration from Ireland had started in earnest by the time of the Great Hunger, which began in Ireland in 1845. In fact, Irish born in Albany, according to the state census, numbered 14,000, give or take, of the 86,500 people who lived here in 1875. And they were 12,500 of the 90,000 in 1880. Now, I'm aware that as a blow-in, who until 4 years ago thought that upstate New York was anywhere north of Westchester, I am preaching to the choir tonight, and that there are people watching this video who know much more about Albany's history than I do. So I'm not going to give a roll call of prominent Irish people who lived in Albany at the time. Instead, I'm going to talk more kind of generally about what life was like for these Irish and Irish Americans during the Gilded Age. As they did everywhere, the Irish quickly and for the most part successfully became involved in politics, labour and the church. So if we look at what life was like for people on both sides of these extremes that I've described, that's what I hope to do tonight. So it won't necessarily be a definitive history of the Irish in Albany. William Rowley has looked extensively at the Albany Irish in his book, Albany, A Tale of Two Cities, which describes the division between Catholic and Protestants in this city, a division which lasted well into the 20th century. It transcended ethnic divisions on one hand, because Dutch and Anglo-Protestants were on one side, while Irish, German and Italian Catholics might be on the other. Rowley paints a picture of a city with deeply ingrained division, country clubs, schools, and banks were all absolutely segregated by religion. Reginald Byron's epic Irish America grappled with in what senses and to what degrees the descendants of 19th century Irish immigrants in Albany possessed distinctive social practices and ways of seeing the world. And he raises questions about the social conditions in which ideas of Irishness were created and recreated. So those two books in particular describe a community that was cohesive in some ways, some might say insular, and quite homogenous. I think that this homogenous Irish identity was probably at its peak in Albany during this Gilded Age, and in fact started to dilute in the early 20th and mid 20th centuries. The Irish were powerful because of the numbers they were here in, and because most of them spoke English, so they automatically had an advantage over other immigrants. What keeps these Irish Americans so united in their outlook was what worked for Irish people throughout American cities. They identify initially with their parish. They often work in the same factories or firms. Their children attend the same schools. They join the same fraternal society. Sometimes they're not allowed to join other ones, so that sense of kind of isolation maybe inspires them to group together. They often vote the same way, but they were not all necessarily pro-Tammany Democrats, and they celebrate naturally and grieve together. So there were differences between Irish Americans, particularly class differences, but it seems that in the Gilded Age, religion was a greater divide, especially socially. So politicians then were people who could perhaps bridge that divide. Elected representatives were able to hobnob with the best of them, but could also meet and had to meet widows or factory workers in their homes or on the streets to appeal for their vote. So it must have warmed the cockles of every Irish American when Michael Nolan was elected mayor here in Albany in 1878. Born in County Carlow in Ireland, he was the first Roman Catholic to be elected mayor in the city. He served as mayor from 78 to 83, and he was a US congressman from 81 to 83. His election in 78 was a high point for Irish power in this city, but he was a conservative Democrat, not necessarily a Tammanyite. His rags to riches story endeared him to his constituents and also seemed to do him no harm with the men of his own social status either, this kind of hard-working, image that he presented. He worked his way up, bookkeeping at John McKnight's brewery. He read law in Peter Kager's office. He worked as a ticket agent for the New York Central. And during the war, he was an assistant superintendent for a railway in California. He married the daughter of an Albany brewer. And after the war, he and his brother-in-law, Terence Quinn, made the business, the business he married into, the largest ale and beer manufacturer in town. Nolan took over as president in 1876, when Quinn became the first Albany Irishman elected to Congress. And then in 1878, as I said, he took over City Hall. He was elected mayor partly because Irish power had by then come of age, but also partly because he was a safe and relatively conservative man. The Fort Orange Club was formed in 1880 to consist of gentlemen who represented that which was best in Albany, men of distinction, of culture, of good manners, of high character, of attainments, of social quality, the men who were born at the top, as well as those who possessed the qualities which make good men and had risen to the top. There's the Fort Orange Club there. Erastus Corning Jr. was naturally the first president, but Michael Nolan, president of the Beaverwick Brewing Company, and later John H. Farrell, publisher of the Times Union, were also founding members. Later on, the sons of William Cassidy and John Tracy were accepted, and in 1898, Charles Tracy became the first Irish president of the club. So here's, Farrell that I just mentioned, who was a founding member of the Orange Club, but also, of course, publisher of the Times Union. And there's some of the most famous politicians that you can see. Now, at the other end of the scale was somebody like Kate Mullaney, who worked in one of the 14 commercial laundries in Troy, where competition for jobs were fierce. Women worked 12 to 14 hour days, 12 to 14 hours, yes, every day, washing with soap, bleaching with chloride of soda, adding dilute sulfuric acid to bleach collars, washing the collar again with suds, boiling, rubbing and rinsing, starching with thick and thin starch, then drying and ironing. Girls depended on each other to do their part of the job properly. So even though the water was boiling hot and their hands were in bleaches and soaps and caustic kind of chemicals all day, and many were burned from the irons, they did their best to do that job properly, earning between $3 and $4 a week. And of course, if they damaged a shirt or a collar, their wages would be reduced. Over 3,000 women, almost half of Troy's female industrial workers, were employed in the collar industry. And laundry owners recognized the importance of these ironers by the wages they paid the respective laundry workers. Washers earned the least, starchers earned a little bit more, while the iron women were paid wages that were considerably higher. However, in February of 1864, Kate and her co-worker Esther Keegan organized approximately 300 women into the first female union in the country, the Collar Laundry Union. So you're just seeing some of these factories here. Shortly after forming the union at noon on February 23rd in 1864, approximately 300 women went on strike from 14 commercial laundry establishments. The wages demands were for maybe a 20 to 25% increase, and they were concerned about danger handling the machinery, particularly heavy and hot starching machines. At first, the laundry proprietors did not bend. They basically said there wasn't enough of a profit margin, they couldn't pass it on. You know, they could not afford to pass on unless they passed on the cost of these higher wages to the manufacturing. For 5.5 days, Kate, Esther, and the others stayed off the job. And then on February 28th, a few of the owners of the laundries gave in to the demands. And then the next day, more of them followed. So that strike had been a success. They were forced to strike again in 1866. And soon after, Collar Laundry Union members' earnings increased from $8 to $14. Now, Kate became involved. You can see here some of the famous Heinz collection photographs about, you know, children and women working in factories. Kate traveled to New York City to attend the National Labour Congress meeting, which was held in Germania Hall. There were 3 other female immigrants: Mary Kellogg Putnam from New York City, Susan B. Anthony from also New York City, and Mary A. MacDonald, who was from Mount Vernon, New York. So Kate was elected to the office of second vice president, but she turned it down because the first vice president was also from New York State. But Kate was subsequently appointed assistant secretary. This is the first time in American history that a woman had been elected or appointed to a national labor union office. Her responsibility then included corresponding with women throughout the country and coordinating national efforts to form working women's associations. William Silvas, who was the main organizer of the union, said, "We now have a recognized officer from the female side of the house, one of the smartest and most energetic women in America. And from the great work which she has already done, I think it not unlikely that we may in the future have delegates representing 300,000 working women." So, you know, these women have to continue to go on strike. They used Troy newspapers to, or at least the employers, sorry, used Troy newspapers to vilify the members of the collar and laundry unions. They often hired or rehired laundry women at slightly higher wages on the condition that they would give up union membership. And so it was incredibly difficult, you know, to try and sustain this movement forward for the workers. In 1869, the Working Man's Advocate announced that the Merchant Prince of New York, A.T. Stewart, and this is his store here, nicknamed the Crystal Palace, he was also an Irish immigrant from the north of Ireland, agreed to take all the goods manufactured by the Union Line, Collar and Cuff manufactory. Stewart, as I say, an immigrant from County Antrim, revolutionized shopping in the city. His first store down here on Chambers Street was built in 1846 and was an Italianate marble palace, which became a household name and landmark within 4 years, frequently cited in ladies' journals and newspapers. Basically, Stewart redesigned the shop interior with an early version of almost a modern department store. So women could browse, they could pick up, you know, ready-made clothing. There was a factory on the top floor which would kind of either produce the clothing but also tailor them, you know, for customers. And so you could see goods instead of going in and ordering a dress, you know, to order. So this idea of kind of an all retail store, he feminized shopping actually, because now ladies could go together and browse. He built a second store a little bit further uptown on Broadway between 9th and 10th Street. And this was specifically kind of dedicated to the woman's shopping experience. This initial store was actually a mix of wholesale and retail. So Stewart's uptown expansion prefigured the development of a specialized ladies' mile, which was various emporiums offering fabrics and ready-to-wear clothing like Lord and Taylor, Beck's, and Arnold Constable and Company. So all of these stores offered conveniences and comforts to entice female shoppers to linger. The Iron Palace had a first floor counter where customers could write out notes and orders to Macy's had a soda fountain established in 1870. So this equation of shopping with other forms of commercialized leisure became even more pronounced towards the end of the century, with the incorporation of ladies' lunchrooms into ever-expanding palaces of consumption. Kate, Milani, and the other members of the union then must have been delighted when Stewart was going to accept goods, you know, taken from their laundry. So here they are. Here's Stewart's factory in downtown New York, the sewing room at his store between 9th and 10th Avenue. Not quite, you know, sweatshop conditions, but still an incredibly busy store, and of course, you know, a very woman-centric organization. Now, throughout this time in Albany, you know, we know that the membership in the cooperative collar unions dropped precipitously, and in fact, they had to dissolve the union in 1870. Now, these are some of the men who are noted in, the book was called Notable Irish in This Region. And I guess what I was, you know, trying to look at with this section of the talk was that the Irish are very self-conscious about their status. So this is John Henry Farrell. We said he was a leading, you know, member of the Orange Club. He was you know, he became involved with the paper here, the Knickerbocker, and then the Evening Union and Times, consolidating them into becoming the Times Union. So these are social directories, basically representative young Irish Americans of Troy, New York. Here's Coffee, and it lists, you know, who they're married, whether they have children or not, their job. And I will say, not everyone in the book, funnily enough, is actually necessarily, you know, high class, but or is not working, you know, in an incredibly powerful positions. A lot of them are clerks. There may be reading law, or they might even, you know, work in stores. But certainly there's this consciousness of their Catholicism, a lot of them, but also their association with, you know, Catholic Benevolent Legions, alumni associations, and other fraternal organizations. So I just thought it was important, you know, that by 1889, as this book is published, there is almost a social directory, you know, in place in Albany and Troy to kind of showcase, you know, good, well-performing, we'll say, Irish Americans. Now, Irish American women have an incredible multifaceted experience here in America. Irish women tended, as did Irish men in Ireland, there's a delayed marriage or often a non-marriage. And so Irish women immigrate on their own. They're often, in some years, we outnumber men who come. And in contrast, you know, with Eastern European women or Italian women who come as family members, many do not work outside of the home, although I will say Italian girls often work in factories. Towards the end of the 1880s and the 1890s, Irish girls are starting to work as domestic servants, a little bit earlier than that too. The Irish, you know, despite the fact that it is quite patriarchal at home in Ireland, and certainly, you know, there's a great deal of attention paid to what the Catholic Church wants, there's a funny culture in Ireland that fostered female self-assertion and social independence. quite matriarchal. On the one hand, the social world of Irish men and women was based firmly on sort of these separate spheres. So it wasn't a problem for single Irish women to migrate and to delay marriage and accept the relative isolation of a job as a maid, or a live-in servant. Now, despite the fact that this was hard physical work, domestic service was an alluring proposition for women, more so than working in a factory, because it paid relatively well. Women were, obviously housed within the home, so they could save their wages. And remittances to Ireland from Irish girls is absolutely, keeping the country afloat. Much more reliable. Irish girls, immigrants, are much more reliable for a family at home in Ireland than Irish males, many of whom, working in hard physical labor jobs or construction. They might be injured, they might, abscond, sort of thing. An Irish girl was much more likely to get into service and sort of stay in service. So one study indicates that Irish workers just in New York City sent over $20 million to families back home in Ireland in the decade following the Great Hunger. So that's the 1850s into the 1860s. Now, I'm going to show you some press coverage, we'll say, of these women. And in words which seem almost prophetic of the troubles to come during the Gilded Age, Ralph Waldo Emerson speculated on the relationship between antebellum class-based political strife and the servant problem in 1840. He wrote, "The case of the menaced and insulted monarch is not quite aloof from our own experience. For see this wide society in which we talk of the interests of labouring men, and yet we allow ourselves to be served by them. We pay them money and then turn our backs on them. This tree always bears one fruit. In every household, the peace of the pear is poisoned by the malice, slyness, indolence, and alienation of domestics. In every knot of labourers or boys, the rich man does not feel himself among friends but enemies, and at the polls, he finds them arrayed in a mass in distinct opposition to him. Yet all these are but signs of an opposition of interest more deep, which gives a certain insecurity and terror to all his enjoyments, for he feels himself an insulted and hated noble." So, there is huge pushback to Catholic immigrants, most of whom, of course, are Irish in the 1840s and 50s. And some of this is kind of, evident maybe in what Emerson is talking about here, that it's not just class that's keeping people separate, it's this awareness of their differences. And this plays out particularly in politics. So there's a huge influx of Irish immigrants after the Great Hunger. And this vision that America had of itself, the kind of Jeffersonian vision of a nation of independent rural republicans, becomes more and more elusive as America's dark satanic mills and increasing industrialization drew hundreds of thousands of poor immigrants whose arrival transformed the country. And then domestic service introduced into the private sphere this ethnic and class conflict, which was rocking the political world outside. And you see that exemplified here in the cartoon, which, this Irish woman, very brawny, not particularly attractive. Irish Americans or Irish immigrants are often portrayed with kind of simian features. Her dress has shamrocks on it. It's not the correct length. She's clearly not kind of adapted to American cultures and customs very well. And then, here's a very stereotypical WASP, mistress who's the embodiment of femininity. Whereas this tyrant, Bridget, the Irish Declaration of Independence, she's breaking cups. This thing is overflowing. She's probably burning the pie in the oven. So all of these kind of things that are playing out on the stage outside, where, there's increased tension among politicians and, even kind of firemen and policemen, is playing out in the American home as well. So here's another one. They were evicted in the old country, but in America, they do all the evicting themselves. So, all of these tropes would have been highly recognizable to American audiences of the time. Again, this maid, very overdressed, the patterns are kind of clashing, too corseted, an Irish cop in the corner being fed, a picture of the Pope or the Bishop, on the wall. And here's a very demure, sort of the image of graceful femininity, you know, in direct contrast to the kind of hellion that's running the kitchen. And yet here they were back in Ireland again with, you know, the simian features, this idea, look, of, you know, the bottles on the kitchen and the pigs in the kitchen, indolent, you know, kind of thing, lazy. What are they working at, you know, kind of thing. She's just waiting here begging, no men. And of course, you know, this is not an accurate picture of either scene. This is more like what traditional Irish American staff would have looked like. Of course, they would have been uniformed, you know, heavy work, we said, often isolating. And I want to get into that. And so I'll let you kind of look at this. This cartoon is, you know, you can either have these, it says, these different scenarios where, you know, Bridget wants callers whenever asked. Sometimes Bridget is playing deaf. You know, all of these things are kind of what will happen if you don't do this. Whereas if you take matters into your own hands, it says, and keep her in her place. Like, look at how now Bridget is almost Americanized. You know, she's a much more demure. She still is quite strong, but her clothing is correct. The features are no longer simian featured, and she's doing what the mistress who holds the keys to the house, you know, and she's directing her. She's doing what she's told. And so this is how the American housewife should conduct business, because otherwise you have this simian featured woman kind of taking over. So you can look at the captions on that while I talk about this. Now, of course, the problem with students of 19th century domestic service study is that there's, for the servant, of course, is almost obscure in terms of documentation. The written sources which exist about domestic service were left by employers, because house servants do not have the time, and frequently they do not have the literacy to be able to write letters or diaries and leave records. Material culture resources are similarly biased. It's the families, you know, objects that you're looking at. And it was the material world of their employers that servants were assigned to maintain and preserve. So the work dresses or tools of the domestic rarely survive their periods of usefulness, while Victoriana that stocks house museums were carefully tended and later collected by curators. So it can be difficult to reconstruct life for these servants. Detailed personal sources are limited generally because domestic service could contain painful relationships. It might mean, you know, that something happened in a home that had to be swept under the carpet, both at the time by the domestics and the employers themselves, and so subsequently by museums. In addition, as historians like Margaret Lynch Brennan, Hassia Diner, and Faye Dutton have pointed out, this selectivity of memory has worked against domestic service, not only because it was painful, but also because it was part of the female experiences. And so those pains were considered private, disconnected, and undignified. So, you know, if a maid becomes pregnant or is raped or any of those, it's very difficult to reconstruct, you know, those instances. So historians have had to work hard to try to clear the smokescreen of domestic ideology and class and ethnic prejudice from this history of 19th century households, so that we can uncover the lives of domestics as both workers and immigrants, but also as women. So census records can reveal Irish household staff, and the census shows the turnover often of staff in houses like Cherry Hill or Tenbrook here in Albany. The rate of turnover among servants can be explained by a number of factors, including seasonal house closings and dismissals. I'll go back to that one because it's prettier. As it was far from unusual for servants to quit jobs at which they were unhappy, having no contracts or other commitments to their employers and good prospects for other jobs. And they also had connections to huge networks of information. So people would pass on, you know, information about what kind of a house somebody ran, or, you know, whether you could get more money, for instance. Depending on the location of the house, servants might have keenly experienced isolation. You know, certainly this is a problem for staff down in places like Lindenwald or Kinderhook, you know, where Irish staff exist, but they frequently leave because of this isolation. It might be difficult to get to a Catholic church in some places. Irish women were sometimes in competition with women of color too for these jobs, particularly as cooks, which would have been better paid, you know, than just as strictly a maid. Domestics' hours were long and often irregular, depending on the wishes of the employer. The lack of leisure certainly had a negative impact on the health of these servants. Most servants worked from sunrise to sunset, at least 10 hours a day, with really a full day being about 11 or 12 hours. A full paid day off for servants was rare. Generally, servants had one evening or half day per week. Servants were, of course, almost always on call because these houses had extensive bell systems which reached even into their bedrooms. Domestics were ignored naturally when organized workers started to achieve legislation for shortened work hours. So this has long-term effects for women of color, you know, who work as cleaners or other types of, you know, domestic service, but even in hotels and things. So the physically demanding nature of 19th century housework, of course, called for adequate nutrition. Whether a servant received it, though, varied from household to household. Servants generally ate the leftovers from the family meal, which might or might not be enough to feed them. Sometimes in a servant's dining room, which was usually located near or in the kitchen. But commonly, servants ate, worked and snatched leisure moments throughout the day in the kitchen. So, you know, there may not have been a sit-down meal that's often portrayed in things like Downton Abbey, you know. When a servant's day was finally through, she retired to her quarters, which of course were usually in the attic or the basement, and furnished with cast-offs from the family, a bed, perhaps a chair and a waiststand, but maybe no carpets or curtains, and certainly no like decoration, unless she was able to provide it for herself. These contrasts reinforce the social distance between employer and servant. Servants' rooms do not have privacy. Not only are they, you know, being assaulted by the bell ringing if they are needed, but they often share rooms with other servants. The decoration up there is very, very plain. You know, it's whitewashed walls, pine floors, nothing like the decor, you know, of the lower floors where the family would have lived. Pegs on walls in most of these rooms indicate that they don't have chests of drawers or a wardrobe. And of course, there's really no heating or ventilation. And so the rooms are hot in the summer and cold in winter. There's usually no fireplaces in the rooms or furnace ducts or any kind of evidence of stoves. So, excuse me. It's not surprising, given these kind of close quarters, that there is often conflict among the servants themselves. President Van Buren, who hired several Irish girls over the years to work in his Lindenwald mansion, even wrote about one instance in his own home in his diary. He wrote, "The two women I made swear eternal friendship got jealous of each other. The cook could no longer keep down the devil that I saw in the corner of her eye when she first arrived, and I have a sort of riot downstairs. Finding that soft words were of no effect, I assumed towards them an aspect more sour and ferocious than you can imagine. I suspended the cook and a very devout Irish chambermaid, who with all her piety is a devil of a bully. The female waiter has escaped unhurt." And so he called this intra-household conflict a riot. And this was, of course, a very potent metaphor at the time because it has significant political connotations. As you know, there were quite a lot of Catholic and Protestant riots, with the Orange Order riots and all these things in New York at the time. So historian Daniel Sutherland has said that servants were both in the household but not of it. They constituted a separate society within a society, inhabiting awkward and uncomfortable spaces while tending to the comfort of others, forced to recognize constantly the contrast between these two different lifestyles under one roof. Some servants rarely required access, mind you, to the main areas of the house. Cooks or scullery maids spent most of their time in the kitchen, which was frequently in the basement. Cooks, you know, worked countless hours in basement kitchens with very small windows, possibly a sink and a hand pump. There could be a coal-burning stove, or in some of the larger mansions, you know, networks of stoves and hobs. So kitchens were hot and crowded, technically sooty and dirty by our modern standards, with cupboards and work tables and perhaps a chair or two. Massive cleaning and working goes into keeping these kitchens You know, there was hardly any commercial cleaning products, and so everything was hand sanded or salted. There's a lot of camphor and lye and vinegar being used, or homemade, you know, mixtures of these. The advice manuals at the time suggest 2 thorough cleanings per week with daily sweeping and wiping. Sinks were scalded with lye, and work surfaces are rubbed with, you know, cotton, floors are mopped, all of that kind of stuff. The parlour maid would take care of the main upstairs, we call them social rooms, like libraries, hallways, drawing rooms, and parlours. Again, no real technological innovation happening here. It was just elbow grease. And you can imagine these rooms were held to incredibly high standards because these were the rooms that the public would see. So, you know, as more and more furniture and, you know, ornate kind of furnishings, and it's a very ostentatious time, the Gilded Age. You know, there's a lot of paintings and ornamentation and, you know, tchotchkes on shelves. All of those have to be cleaned and dusted. And so incredibly busy work if you were a maid. And then the upstairs maids, or the chambermaids, had to be aired and dusted once the family went down to breakfast. Chamber pots had to be emptied and cleaned. You know, there's a lot of talk in maids' manual books about smuggling very quietly the chamber pot so that the family who have sensitive feelings, you know, wouldn't be disturbed by their own waste. The fireplaces have to be cleaned, wash basins emptied, beds made, soap and towels and candles and all those things, you know, have to be resupplied. And again, at night, supply with maybe warm water to wash off the effects of the day, and fresh drinking water. But laundry was the worst. And like, it depended. Some houses did not have a team of different kinds of maids. So if you were the only maid in a home, which many Irish girls were, you have to do all of these jobs. You possibly don't have to cook, or you possibly don't have to do laundry, but you would be responsible for all of the cleaning in all of the different areas. Laundry was often hired out, but this was an absolutely hated job. If there was available on site a washroom, there was a sink and a hand pump. And no more than Kate Malani and her girls in the factories, you know, they are using harsh chemicals. There's a lot of wear and tear on the body because they've got to heat pots and pots of water on the stove. And then washing was done in tubs using a stick or a washboard, and then a wringer. You have a drying rack. So, you know, it was it kind of took over the house if you were doing it in the home. Now, this piece here is from Louisa May Alcott, beloved writer of Little Women, but she talks about how difficult it was to hire a girl to replace. She says it here in the first paragraph: for several years, Irish incapables have reigned in our kitchen, and general discomfort has pervaded the house. The girl then serving had been with us a year and was an unusually intelligent person, but the faults of her race, endemic, you know, seemed to be unconquerable. And the winter had been a most trying one all around. So they fired that unusually intelligent Irish girl, but who's, you know, absolutely the same as all the rest of them. So she says, Biddy must go. Now, the girl fought back. She said, you won't get anyone else, Mum, so early in the season, said Biddy with much satisfaction at my approaching downfall. Then I'll do the work myself so you can pack up, was my undaunted reply. And sure enough, she did have to do the work for a month because she couldn't get somebody. No Irish need apply was my answer to the half dozen girls who, despite Biddy's prophecy, did come to take the place. And this article goes on for several, you know, pages, and she eventually, you know, she hires an American girl, but that woman doesn't work out because she's not really able for the physical labor. And she goes through all of these different servants, bemoaning, you know, how popular Irish maids are. So it's a very interesting article. But she says, this is how she ends it: dear ladies, don't say this is sentimental or impossible, but try it in all good faith and take the word of one who has known both sides of the mistress and maid question, that if you do your part faithfully, you need never again have your substance wasted, your peace destroyed, and your home invaded by foreign incapables. And she means Irish when she says foreign there, which I think is, you know, very interesting. Boston. So I'll just do a quick run through of the portrayal of the Irish in American media during this era. A lot, as you can see here, of caricatures, many of them drawn by another immigrant, actually, Thomas Nast, who was a German Catholic. He converted because he married quite a wealthy Protestant American woman. So this is from 1886, you know, the day we celebrate this St. Patrick's Day, and of course they're calling it an Irish riot of blood and rum. Now, by 1886, many of the policemen would have been Irish too, but you can see here these Irishmen have the simian featured, they're all carrying a shillelagh or a stick, you know, they've got these sashes to kind of bring to mind, you know, these fraternal societies. And then here are these, you know, very lovely Yankee boys that are being absolutely kicked and almost murdered by the Irish savages, you know. So ethnic caricature during this time was paternalistic, very often degrading, and sometimes antagonistic. And we will say, you know, culture kind of shifted as Irish became eventually producers of culture instead of just the butt of it or consumers of culture. So you know, these sociable servants and laborers, scheming politicians, disorderly troublemakers filled the pages of various journals. Later on, upwardly mobile, socially ambitious, sometimes nouveau riche types, you know, where it's kind of mocking, but it's not as aggressive, you know, as this portrayal, begin to appear in American periodicals. And so lace curtain Irish, urbanized Irish maids replaced the simian feature paddy. So, you know, this nativist movement of the 1850s had ended, but there was still quite a strong anti-hyphen American movement right into the early 20th century. And Al Smith's failed bid for president in 1928 served to show not just the Irish, but even maybe other Catholics, that they were still on the margins of American society. The Irish in particular had kind of grown confident in their space, even though this again is from the late 1880s, 1889. This is the mortar of assimilation and the one element that won't mix. And this is an Irish, you know, this kind of monkey guy. He's holding the green flag with the harp of Ireland and a dagger. And it says the mortar of assimilation and the one element that won't mix. So here's, you know, Columbia trying her best to stir the cup of citizenship with equal rights, but Paddy will not, you know, give in. Here's another one, a very famous one, Uncle Sam's lodging house in Puck. This is from 1882. So Paddy is being obviously very disruptive. Everybody else is asleep. You can see here, you know, it's labeled Negro. The portrayal there is very interesting too. You know, his feet are overhanging the bed, possibly kind of identifying him with Paddy, you know, that these two are a little bit closer than everybody else. You know, the Russian is tucked up neatly in his bed, as is the Spaniard, the Frenchman. He's waking the poor old Englishman, John Bull here, and the German is perfectly asleep. Fritz almost always depicted, you know, with a mustache and sunglasses. So the Irishman is throwing these bricks again, wrapped in the green flag of air, and here he is, look, with, you know, some alcohol, perhaps, and Uncle Sam and his wife Columbia back here disturbed. He is throwing the bricks, say the Chinese must go, recall Lowell, which of course very famous girls factories, and Irish independence. And so the only two that are really rousing, look, is the Chinese man, which don't forget by 1882 we are getting into, you know, this Yellow Pearl era, but also the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevents particularly Chinese women from coming in. So these are immigrants who are being targeted by anti-immigrant sentimentality, and also the Englishmen, because don't forget the Fenian movement, very strong in Ireland at the time, and a lot of it being funded by Irish Americans here. Everybody else is sleeping through it. Here's another one. Thomas Nast, as I say, was particularly obsessed kind of thing with the anti-Catholics, but also with just people who almost kind of refuse to assimilate. And so this is Columbia, stuck between two evils. And one of them is, you know, social unionism. This is the German kind of stereotype. And here's the Irish political machinery. And again, very simian featured, violent, you know, but maybe this fear of the takeover of the Democratic Party, particularly in New York. Excuse me. The shadow in our schools. This plays out again and again in the Gilded Age. This idea, you know, that the Catholic Church were coming for, you know, WASP students. In fact, there was a movement to try to end the reading of the King James Bible in the public schools because Catholics did not use that Bible. But you know, so they actually grew up, particularly in cities like New York, a very strong parochial school system, which initially was often free or certainly kind of cheaper, so that immigrant children could be educated in the Catholic faith, even though they were semi-public. Here's another very famous one, the American River Ganges. And so, you know, these bishop crocodiles with St. Peter's and Tammany Hall in the background, coming to attack American school children. And here's another, these caricatures, you know, that show the path of Paddy, who comes, you know, as a pauper, kind of more or less carrying nothing with him, Paddy O'Rourke. Then he works in construction, he's Pat O'Rourke. Eventually he becomes Officer O'Rourke, and then he's the Honourable Mr. Rourke. So it shows that kind of upward mobility, but a very stereotypical advancement too for an Irish American. And I suppose there's kind of the insinuation that you can't really trust this guy because he became, you know, he began this. And so despite all the kind of trappings of honourable and dropping the O and, you know, maybe this popular politician that he is, he really is, you know, Paddy O'Rourke, itinerant worker. Here's another one that kind of gets at, again, Tammany, the killing the goose that laid the golden egg from 1871. So the Catholic Church almost in cahoots with this, you know, seedy looking, violent Irish figure and carving up the Democratic Party. It says, a certain man had the good fortune to possess a goose that laid him a golden egg every day, but dissatisfied with so slow an income and thinking to seize the whole treasure at once, he killed the goose and cutting her open found her just what any other goose would be. So from Aesop's Fables. So, you know, that these two will destroy the power that they have, and all of these eggs back here are labeled with, you know, public money and all kinds of different perks that the Irish are trying to keep for themselves. So the Gilded Age, as I said, is problematic for the Irish, even the successful ones, in many ways. Sorry, I've said this already. The Smith's failed bid, which goes right into 1928, you know, show them that they still had work to do. There is a degree of confidence in their position as ethnic Americans after World War I, particularly because so many of them fought for America, even though there was quite a concerted effort at the beginning of the war to keep America neutral. Irish and Germans both, you know, wanted that. And many of the immigrants or hyphenated Americans are at the forefront of the Americanization process for newer immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. The National Origins Act of 1924 did not impact necessarily on the Irish or the Germans because it was based on proportions of existing numbers, 2 or 3% of who was already in the country. But the loss of 1928 was seen as a rejection of otherness in American society. It was a kind of a warning to ethnic Americans, Catholic and Jewish, that they were not fully American. So Smith's loss ushered in a period just after the Gilded Age of what it meant to be an ethnic in America. It wasn't really acceptable to be hyphenated or ethnic, and you would have to find a way to become American Irish instead of Irish American. So British stereotypes of the Irish as ungovernable rebels who would corrupt the political process had followed them across the Atlantic. The most common complaint about the Irish, their clannish pugnaciousness, was often criticized in American writings. In 1896, so, you know, almost towards the end of the Gilded Age, Junius Henry Browne wrote in The Great Metropolis, a mirror to the city, "The trouble with the natives of Erin is that there is no purgatory between the inferno of their own country and the paradise of this. That would fit them for entering upon a broader and higher mode of existence. They rarely understand their own existence. The change is too sudden, and they and those brought in contact with them suffer from it. They are made the dupes of others, and their impulsiveness overrides their reason and keeps them at constant disadvantage." So, you know, there's this idea that it's very difficult for Irish Catholic immigrants to become fully productive American Republican citizens because their inherent traits and their native kind of clannishness is going to work against them in America. So there is a revival of anti-Catholicism and a huge upsurge in the KKK, for instance, even in New York State, terrible attacks in Buffalo against Irish. And so finally, World War I at the end, you know, we said it just after the Gilded Age, led to calls for the Americanization of all immigrants. So the Irish immigrants face a very complex political landscape. They certainly in New York and Boston and Chicago are very powerful in unions and in city politics. They have a growing ambivalence towards their own ethnic heritage as they become second and third generation, maybe immigrants. They have risen through the ranks of politics. They've worked their way up within one generation, often from being maids to being school teachers or nurses. Naturally, they dominate the Catholic Church in the cities, which is spreading and growing, and more churches being built. They contribute to a thriving press and theatrical culture in all cities. But despite their numbers and their confidence, they're very conscious of their outsider status in relation to Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So Irish Americans find themselves torn between wanting to help these newer immigrants coming in from Southern and maybe, you know, Eastern Europe, because they're trapped themselves between the native born and the immigrant, and their own ranks are being replenished by newly arriving Irish immigrants too. So they often kind of act in the role of mediator. The new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europeans seem more alien sometimes to the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Americans than the more established groups like the Irish and the Germans. As an immigrant group with deep roots in American societies, Irish Americans are trying to navigate their impulse to embrace American values and their commitment to shield fellow immigrants, because they are still talked about, you know, sometimes themselves as ethnic or immigrant Americans, from nativist scorn. As a social group that had only recently ascended into the middle class, they were torn between the desire to assimilate into genteel classes and this attempt to kind of wield their political power on behalf of the urban poor. And of course, you know, as politicians, often their vote dependent on poor or other ethnic Americans, particularly in a city like New York, where, you know, the Irish would move up and out of the district, but the guy was still representing that district. So now you have to appeal to Italian or Jewish voters. Union membership too became you know, kind of more rife with trouble as more diverse workers come into the workforce. It's not just Irish guys who want to be members, and so people of color are sometimes sidelined rather than being welcomed into these unions. I think Peter Quinn describes this upward mobility probably best of the Irish American writers in one of his essays, Looking for Jimmy. He says that Paddy had been replaced by Jimmy, and where Paddy had been a hairy, beetling-browed alien with a wild and savage aspect, Jimmy was slick, smooth, an evolutionary adaptation to the American scene, who not only looked and acted like he belonged, but at some level actually seemed to embody what urban life was all about. Though barely removed from his working class origins, this Jimmy type knows what to drink and how to dress. He seeks to insinuate himself among the privileged, not because he admires their morals or envies their genes, but because theirs is the power and the glory and the wealth and the beautiful, sophisticated women. So there's this idea of, you know, Paddy becoming Jimmy to change the game to suit himself a little bit more. Changing demographics meant that the Irish were no longer the most visible of immigrant groups, particularly after the Gilded Age. But the pathways they forged and their model of adjustment to life in America continued to be used by other immigrant groups who were eager to embrace America and to have a voice in her institutions. So the Gilded Age was a transformative time for the Irish in America, realistically. You know, they had come in desperate poverty during the Great Hunger. They're here, of course, before the Great Hunger, but they're often Protestant and settle in kind of more south, you know, the colonies, the 13 colonies originally, whereas then the coming of the Erie Canal and certainly the Great Hunger brings in this huge influx of Irish Catholics. And then, you know, you could argue the Civil War sort of helps to rehabilitate their image a little bit because they're known for their bravery and certainly, you know, their patriotism, their willingness to die for America. And yet during the Gilded Age, that's kind of challenged because of these, I would say, you know, labor tensions, class tensions, and this religious divide. So I hope you can take a little overview of this very rushed look at the Irish in Gilded Age, New York and Albany. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the Cherry Hill series. Take care.